And we're going to need everybody to mute their microphones.
Okay. And here we go. Can everybody see this?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, you weren't supposed to see that yet because it was, it's the end. Okay, whatever. Here we go. James Trager is talking. Hi, everybody. So in case you had nobody introduced me formally, but a lot of you, of course, I've met over the years, and it's nice to see your shining faces, even in the indoor light. I'm going to be talking about ants, Pismires, and Emmets. Guess what? Those are all the same. Those are various English. We're fortunate in English to have a rich vocabulary regarding ants. We have 3 different words for ants. 4 if there's one other that I didn't include. But anyway, I actually have an entomology PhD from the University of Florida, and I wrote my dissertation on ants, and I've published several times since getting out of school, occasionally through my years at Shaw Nature Reserve and so on. I want to give special thanks to Alex Wild, who took most of the pictures that are in this presentation. And Alex, and I would just mention kind of parenthetically, I have written a first draft of a guide to Missouri ants. And Alex has kindly offered to provide illustrations of all species of which he has pictures, which is about 2/3 of the Missouri fauna, for my book. So that's a real kind offer. He is a commercial photographer. He's also the curator of the entomology collection at the University of Texas at Austin. Okay, now. Oh boy, let's see. There we go. There are over now 16,000. This slide was made a couple of years ago. And we've got lots of kinds of ants in the world. They're a highly diverse group. They're very abundant individually, in part because they're all social insects. So where there's one, there are always more in its family nearby. And this is just a little kind of a thing I put together with various images to show some of the diversity of form, head shape, mandible shape, and so on. And these are tied into different lifestyles. So a couple of vocabulary items here. First of all, I'll mention that ants are insects. You knew that. They're in the order Hymenoptera, which includes bees and wasps and sawflies, as well as ants and some other things like velvet ants and so on. And also many gall insects, like the oak gall wasplets are hymenopterans. And then, but ants are a single family, and in animal taxonomy, families always end in the IDAE ending. So this is pronounced Formicidae, or if you want to be real Latin about it, you can say it in another way, but in English we call it Formicidae. The study of ants, on the other hand, is called Myrmecology, and this Myrmec is the Greek equivalent of the Latin formic, and it means ants. So this is the study of ants, and only ants. Ants are closely related to bees and wasps, especially to the bees and the hunting wasps in the Ctesidae. These are their closest relatives among the other Hymenoptera. Okay. Just wanted to give you a little view of the faces of people who study ants. I don't have the names of everybody on hand, but these are students from around the world: Brazil, Mozambique. This is, I believe, a German student. These two guys here, these are kind of the top dogs of world myrmecology, or at least North American myrmecology. Phil Ward is just an amazingly nice guy, incredibly intelligent guy who knows probably on site more ant species, more of those 15,000 ant species than anybody else on the planet. And if you've ever heard of AntWeb, which is sort of, it's one of a couple of different go-to ant sites online that both professionals and non-professionals use. Brian Fisher's the guy that started that website, and he's quite a dynamic fellow. I'm also on the editorial board of AntWeb. I'm their go-to Latin grammar guy, among other things. So when our recent task was to make sure that the proper grammatical gender was assigned to every Latin genus name, and that all the species names, where it was necessary, were made to agree with that genus gender. So there you have it. That's the kind of nerdy stuff I do, in addition to ant taxonomy. Okay, so things you can learn about ants. It's not this evening, but I originally made this talk as an evening presentation, so let's learn about it this morning instead. Okay, adult ants, and we'll have some pictures to document this a little bit later on. Adult ants within a colony typically come in at least 2 shapes and sizes. And then also ants have several life stages. We'll get to that, all that, pictures, nice pictures. The work of ants is the following, at least: food gathering, child care, nest building, and repair. And they may do some other things, but these are jobs that are destined to make the colony grow, survive and grow. And all ants live in colonies. There are some workers that, some ant species that have no workers, but even they must live in the colony of another species to survive and grow. They're parasitic. They're called social parasites. Hope you all are taking great notes with your questions for later on. The great majority of ants are meat eaters with a sweet tooth, or you might say they are sweet tooths with a penchant for eating meat, but not all are. And we'll talk about some of those variations a little bit farther along. Ants make a wide variety of different types of nests, but none of them are able to make nests with cells and combs of cells like you see in the social bees and wasps. Ants are generally regarded by predators as disgusting to eat, but they do have natural enemies that are specialized to eat them. And sometimes, yeah, those are species that are taking advantage of an abundant resource on the planet, and which have adapted to deal with the ants' chemical defenses. And ants can be cute, pretty, or funny looking, and we'll see some pictures of all of that too. Okay, so here's the basic ant family. Some of you probably knew this in one form or another. The basic ant family is a reproductive individual, generally referred to as a queen, like the reproductive individual of a bee colony. And she is almost single-handedly responsible for laying all the eggs that give rise to every member of the colony. There are some exceptions where workers contribute, but we won't get into that fine point. But here's, queens are usually bigger than the workers. At the beginning of their lives, they have wings, and these are where the wings are attached along the sides of the thorax. But after mating, they just break them off. They're never going to fly again. And they have this miraculous capacity to store live sperm cells kind of in a suspended animation inside their bodies, releasing them a few at a time to fertilize each egg as they lay it. So that's a pretty good physiological trick. Mate once for the rest of your life. And by the way, queens of some species live over 20 years, maybe even as much as twice that, but most live at least several years. Now the queen and the workers of the species in the upper left here pretty much look a lot alike. But as you can see, sometimes the queen and the workers can be quite different in shape, size, and color, as in this species on the lower right. And this slide on the right also gives you a portent of things to come, because it shows you some of the developing immature ants, the larvae. But before we get to that, let me just mention that there are ants that have 2 or more sizes and shapes of workers. So again, here's the queen with her wing attachments that are no longer necessary. This is a large or major worker, lacking the wing attachments there, which is kind of how we know it's a worker, even though it's nearly the size of the queen. And then there are workers of various smaller sizes with proportionately smaller heads. These two side by side give you a good feel for that. And if you look in the photo on the left, you'll see the vast majority of the worker population are the small minor workers, and here's a major worker. And then in between them is a media worker. Sometimes these are called soldiers and majors and super majors, or even soldiers, as I slipped up and said. Okay, so ants, of any size that you ever encounter out in nature, if they're true ants, they are adult ants. Now there are some things that are out there that look like ants. There's a lot of things that mimic ants. You'll remember I mentioned that ants taste bad to most predators. And so looking like an ant may be a good way to avoid being eaten. Anyway, but ants, like the vast majority of insects, grow up through 3 life stages: the eggs, the larvae, and the pupae stages. The eggs, well, they just look like little eggs. They're little white things. And they have no obvious segmentation. They're tiny, usually smaller than the size of a worker's head, as you can see. And those are the true eggs. And most people call all of this stuff eggs, but only those are the true eggs. The larvae are segmented, legless, grub-like things, as you see in the middle photo here. And they are typically characterized not only by clear body segmentation, after all they are insects, but by the presence of a dark spot somewhere near the center of the body that is their digestive tract. And finally, once the larvae are done growing, the larvae eat prodigiously and grow quite quickly. It takes them just a few weeks to mature from tiny eggs to a full adult size. And then in some ants, they'll spin a cocoon around them, like you see here. And just an interesting sort of trivial factoid is that this black spot on the end of the cocoon there is that black stuff from inside the larval body, basically excreted from the body and deposited as a dry incorporated form of well, it's feces, but it's not like you think, you know, gross poop. This is feces, which is essentially only the solid matter. Ants have a very efficient digestive tract, and there's nothing left in there to spoil or rot or smell. So that just dries in and becomes part of the cocoon. Now, If you look down below here, you can see egg, tiny little things, smaller than the worker's head again. Larvae maturing through various stages, each with the little dark area in between. The larva, in this case, instead of spinning a cocoon, simply molts into the pupa. And this pupa looks like a folded up adult ant that's very pale at first and gradually darkens to the color of the adult, and then it emerges. So inside each one of these cocoons, there's a little pupa like that. Okay, so that's the life cycle. Also, at certain times of year, the ants produce the winged reproductive forms. Worker ants typically never reproduce. They sacrifice all of their reproductive capacity to their mother. And there's actually a good genetic reason for that, but I won't go into the fine points of that, but it's kind of a interesting story. But anyway, here's a queen that still has her wings. I guess you could call her a princess because she's not mated yet, you know. But anyway, and the associated worker stands behind her, and this is what the male looks like. So male ants are very small, typically smaller than the female winged females, often about worker size, sometimes even smaller than that. And they just don't look anything like the same species. I mean, look at these characters with their big, crazy, wide open jaws, and this slender little tan fellow with very minute jaws. That's the male and workers of the same species. This is a male army ant. They're sometimes referred to as sausage flies because they're such big, juicy looking sausagey things. Male of another ant. But notice the thing about all these male ants is they look kind of waspy. Male ants really do kind of reveal the wasp heritage of the ant world. And again, female, male, and worker of all the same species. Okay, so that's the different forms that ants can take, and a little bit about the life cycle. And now let's move along to what do they eat? Many ants eat, most ants feed to some extent on other insects or spiders or millipedes or centipedes, something like that. There are some very specialized predators that basically eat only one other kind of arthropod. And then there are the generalists, which is the great majority of ants that'll take anything they can get their mandibles onto. And the mandibles are the main manipulative tools that ants have. They have some other smaller mouth parts kind of tucked behind the jaws that can be put to use in manipulating food, also used in excavating the nest and so on. So those are the real important tools on the body of an ant. They generally don't make tools of any sort. There's a few little minor uses of particles to absorb liquids and things like that that qualify as tool making, but mostly they just depend on what they have on their bodies. All right, so meat in the diet of ants is usually other insects. I said or spiders, but maybe we should have said other arthropods generally because it includes millipedes and centipedes, which are clearly neither insects nor spiders. Sweets, really important. Not just for ants, but for their close relatives. Remember, bees and the hunting wasps, the sphecids, are their closest relatives. All of them eat a lot of sweet stuff. Bees are famous for it. If you watch flowers, especially the ones with flat tops and lots of little florets, like your dill plants in your garden or your bone set plants in your native plantings or something like that, you're almost invariably going to see not only bees, but some of those hunting wasps and maybe even some ants foraging for nectar in those flowers. Honeydew, we'll talk about a little bit more. And of course, ripe fruit that falls on the ground is fair game for the sweets of sweet component of ants' diets. And if you want to, you know, occasionally they run into a real bonanza when some kid spits his candy out onto the ground, and the ants are not above going to that for their sweets. Seeds, really important in desert areas. They're a great source of carbohydrates and other nutrients, and ants in desert areas, many kinds of ants in desert areas harvest seeds. Now there's a special case of ants harvesting seeds in our region. Some of our spring flora have a special attachment on the outside of the seeds called an elaeosome. I'm sorry, I don't have any pictures of that, which it's got nutritious substances in it, especially lipids, fatty stuff that are highly attractive to the ants, and they will gather those seeds, not to eat the seed itself, but eat this gooey stuff on the outside that smells and tastes good to them. So desert ants usually actually eat the seeds. Ants in our area typically do not, but they may gather them for whatever's on the outside of them. And then there's the fungus growing ants, the famous fungus growing ants of the tropics, but not merely found in the American tropics. We actually have one species in our area. So now just to illustrate these various feeding types, ants feeding on insects and such. Here's an ant stinging a small cricket, and it's stinging it right on the underside where the main nerve cord runs in insects. And if you put the venom right in there, that's instant paralysis. Ants are quite, and there it goes carrying off the cricket. Ants are also tremendous scavengers. Here somebody has slapped a mosquito, and the ants found it lying on the ground, and now they're cutting it up and taking home the pieces to feed their colony. And these are really cool ones that live in tropical Asia. This is Leptogenes calibia. Calibia usually refers to having a bluish reflections. And this picture doesn't show it real well, but this ant is pretty close to jet black, but on the thorax and head especially, there's these metallic blue reflections. But the really cool thing about these guys is they're specialized predators on millipedes that are much larger than any of the individual ants. And but these ants go out on little foraging parties, and when they encounter a millipede, a few of the brave workers will dash in and try to deliver a sting right there on the underbelly where that nerve cord is, just like in the one we talked about earlier. And then they have these things where they grab each other around a constriction in the abdomen. You can see it on this hindmost ant the best. And then make these long daisy chains, which they drag this heavy prey home to their nests. And I thank my colleague Stefan de Graaf, who took these pictures in this picture in Cambodia when he lived there. Stefan, by the way, is studying urban bees around Brussels, Belgium now. That's his new research gig. So sometimes people somehow escape their interest in ants and go look at other stuff. But I never did get tired of the ants, although I did end up making a living working on plants. So I guess that's kind of an escape. Anyway, here are ants eating sweets. Now, a really important source of sweets for ants is provided by glands on plant leaves or buds or sepals, but somewhere else that's outside of flowers. And So this is called extrafloral nectaries. Anyway, you find them on a lot of different plants. Here's a Central American ant and a North American ant getting extrafloral nectaries from some sort of a leaf glands. And then the other thing is aphids, scale insects, and mealybugs. These are all insects that are sap feeders. Sap, of course, has a lot of sugar in it. We're familiar with sugar cane, which has a nice sweet sap. And by the way, here's a cool little factoid. The sap of common milkweed has the same sugar content, as high a sugar content as sugar cane. But to us, it doesn't taste so good because it's protected by the bitter alkaloids that make milkweeds toxic to so many other animals. Anyway, the insects have a real carbohydrate excess in their diets. And so what they do is they have a special form of excretion called, which we call honeydew. But I heard somebody refer to it, a young person that just kind of described it as sugar pee. So it's sort of like that. It's urine, a urine-like clear fluid full of sugar, and that's the main thing that's dissolved in the water in it. And the ants can get a lot of sugary energy from carbohydrate energy from that. And since they run around a lot, they need it. So there you go. Here's some desert ants harvesting seeds. This one is literally excising a grain off of a grass plant. Others may pick them up off the ground and carry them home. This is, these are a couple of southwestern US species, harvester ants that you might see in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, places like that, Southern California. But note that if you climb up on a plant and there's a spider living there, you might get nabbed. So food gathering can be dangerous. Actually, going out of the nest can be dangerous for ants. Staying in can be too. There are some diseases and so on that ants are subject to. But ants are rather fastidiously clean. They're always cleaning themselves and their larvae and so on, and removing spores and other nasty infectious things. Leaf cutting ants are famous for cutting leaves, and what they do is take it home to in these long caravans. One of the interesting things that's been studied is these little guys that ride on the leaf fragments, and they're on most of them. Those are there actually to fend off parasitic flies that might lay their eggs in the bodies of the carrier ants. And I'll show you a picture of one of those later on, but they're a real natural enemy of ants. I'll get to in a bit. And then finally, once this material is brought home, it's chewed up and planted into the fungus garden, and a mold grows on it, which is the primary food of the ant colony. So these are true agricultural ants. They grow a crop which they keep very clean. They're always weeding out the non-edible fungi, and it's a big production. It's quite interesting, well studied. It's funny, people always, every time people go to the tropics, they see the leafcutter ants and just have to take a picture, and they're, oh, James, look, I went to Costa Rica and look what I saw. And I'm all like, oh, yeah, you know, send me some pictures of some other tropical ants, the remaining 1,000 species that were out there, you know, because I've seen a lot of these. Anyway, so fair warning, if you go to Costa Rica, you don't need to send me any leafcutter ant pictures. But if you see some other cool ants, let me see them. Anyway, most ants that were probably around the world nest in or on the ground. And when I say, well, I'll talk about on in a minute, but in is pretty obvious. This is after rains in particular. You'll see that the ants will build up these little characteristic shaped tumuluses or tumuli of soil particles that they dig out of the ground. Sometimes they're just in a sort of a crack in a rock or between rock and the soil, and then they just close off little chambers like this with pellets of soil. And again, here we have an ant colony with quite a few workers. I don't know if there's any queens in there, and some brood, I think. Here's a nest formed of grass fragments that's just made into a little mound on top of the surface. Ants may thus produce their own plant litter to nest in, or they may nest in naturally fallen leaf litter and so on a forest floor. And then these guys are really interesting. They live basically at the interface of rotten wood and soil. And then within that medium, they cut very small particles of the plant material, and they cement it together with body secretions, their saliva, and so on. And look at how neatly they shape all this. And then also it's infused with fungi that are literally found, I shouldn't say literally, but essentially only found in the nests of these kinds of ants. They're symbiotic fungi that basically help the ants build their nests. And then the fungi in turn make a living off the materials that the ants bring in to do this construction. So ants interact with a lot of other species, plants, fungi, even other ants sometimes. And in here we see great examples of them interacting with plants. This is up in the upper left is an ant garden in the Asian tropics. This has multiple species of plants rather, that are literally planted in this pile of soil and plant fragments, and basically it's a compost heap. And it's the ants gain some food from harboring these plants like this, and they live inside this ball inside there. And they live in a bunch of little chambers, look kind of like in the last slide, or there are ants that live inside plant stems, sometimes even in modified growths on the plant that are specially made to harbor ants. The famous weaver ants of the Asian tropics, the green tree ants, also known as green tree ants because they're kind of greenish. They weave together leaves using silk from their larvae. And others make these things that look like a big hornet nest, which is actually made of plant fragments glued together into a ball that they inhabit. Or sometimes they'll take over an existing arboreal termite nest, which is a common thing to see in the tropics. So yeah, lots of different variations on the nesting theme. And then, like I said, ants kind of don't taste good to a lot of things, but there are specialists that feed on them. Here in the second picture is an antlion larva. That's what makes these conical pits in fine sandy or dusty soil under your deck. And they're down there, and if an ant comes along, they'll throw some little particles up really fast and make the ant trip and slide down, and then they'll eat it. They don't just eat ants, but that's most of their diet. Here's an assassin bug eating a male ant. Here's a really cool spider that lives on the same trees as the green tree ants. This is its specialized predator on the green tree ants, and it mimics them in appearance, which probably helps them mix in. And I mentioned parasitic flies that lay their eggs in ants. Here's one zooming in with her ovipositor extended, and she's actually going to line herself up behind the head of this ant and literally inject an egg like a bullet into the back of this ant's head. And the ant does not like the feeling. They writhe for a moment after this happens. And then, but it gets worse from there. The larva hatches out inside the head of the ant and gradually eats the ant's head contents alive. Quite a scene. And then when the larva matures, it pupates, and when it's ready to emerge as a fly, it pops out of the hole at the back of the head, which, just as with the hole in our head, is called the foramen magnum. And the house oozes, the fly oozes out of that and flies away. And then, of course, they're the famous zombie ant fungi, or zombie fungi, which infect the bodies of not just ants, but many insects. And they then they cause, when they're ready to produce their spores, they cause the ants or other insects to climb up onto a plant, and they produce a sporangium, which then sheds spores to the wind. And thus it gets to spread to other host insects. And as I said a few times now, most predators don't like to eat ants, so other insects and spiders may mimic them. There's one ant in this picture. There she is. There's a weirdo tree hopper that has kind of an ant-like look to its thorax appendages that just like are just totally weird. Here's a common plant-feeding bug, a broad-headed bug. We have species of these around here that also has an anty look. But this thing is just amazing. This is actually a jumping spider. It not just looks like the ant, it walks like the ant. I won't go as far as to say it talks like the ant, but look at how its front legs, it's a spider with 8 legs, are modified to look like the antennae of the ant. It's quite a remarkable bit of mimicry. Now I just want to give you a little look at some ants from around the world that sort of don't look like what you might expect for ants. Here's a cool one from Australia with kind of a punk mohawk shock top hair. Beautiful little arboreal ant in the carpenter ant genus from Australia. These are not particularly unusual ants, but this is a pretty cute picture of an ant sniffing its or feeling its sister's head with its antenna, and it just kind of like, you just kind of want to say, "Oh," when you see that picture. You did, right? Want to say, "Oh." Anyway, big eyes, the better to see you with. Notice these kind of ants would. These are called strobe ants. They're another relative of the carpenter ants. They live in Southeast Asia and Australia. And when they see you coming, they move like their natural locomotion. It looks sort of like they're under a strobe light. It's like zzz, 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 zzz. They advance in these little very rapid forward movements, and then they stop. So it looks kind of like a strobe. Anyway, but when they see you coming, it's hard to get to see them locomote because basically the first thing they do is go around to the other side of the stem or leaf that they're walking on. And then this is perhaps my favorite ant in the world. It's called Gigantiops destructor. It's from the American rain and humid forests of the tropics. And you note that it has these big grasshopper-like hind legs. Yes. They do jump with those. They make little leaps like a cricket. And it's kind of fun to see them kind of hopping. They'll walk to the edge of a leaf or a twig or a log or something in the forest, and then leap down to the nearest lower surface, and then they continue walking along with their little prey item, whatever it may be. These are more cute ants. They look like plush toys. They're very tiny. They're less than 2 millimeters long. Now, this is but these are nothing to be contended with if you happen to be a mama spider. They're very good at finding the egg cases of spiders. And you see these little yellow things in there? Those are spider eggs. So what they've done is moved into the spider egg sac, and they're feeding their babies until those spider eggs are all gone with them. And then they'll go out in search of another spider egg sac to inhabit and consume. And last but not least, this is an ant with mandibles that look like a big smile. But again, this is somewhat deceptive. The ant actually uses these, and its pointed front end of the mouth parts here to hold pill bugs, you know, roly-polies like we have around here. These are specialized predators on roly-polies, and they use them to hold those that kind of slippery prey, and that's their primary prey. It's what they eat. If you find a nest of these things, the middens, the trash heaps at the sort of the outer edges of the nest are just full of the whitish, empty shells of the pill bugs. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I'm going to stop the screen share right now, go back to Zoom, and let us converse. Oh, there you all are. Hello, you stayed awake. Yay. Okay, so that was a lot to consume there in pretty rapid succession, but maybe you have some questions, you wrote some notes or whatever, or maybe you have your own questions that weren't touched on in the talk. So how about Jay, since I see your finger up there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, thank you. So there's how many queens per colony, and how, why in a developing reproduction cycle, how does it, are there only special males that help produce queens, or, you know, how many queens per colony? Where do the queens come from, differentiated from the other gender, if that's called what they are?
Yeah, caste is the term that we use because they're all female. Most ants, except for the winged males, are genetically female. Even the workers, which don't reproduce, are genetically female. But anyway, first of all, to your question of how many, as I noted in my slide, one or more. So there are some species which are strictly what are referred to as monogyne, that is, have only a single queen in their colony. Others which may have one to a few. And then there are some ants, such as the invasive Asian pavement ant, which is eating up St. Louis, can have many queens per colony, and those are referred to as polygyne. Now, how do queens come into being?
Right.
Typically, they develop only at certain seasons of the year. In some cases, their development begins in the ovaries of their queen mother, and the eggs get primed by cold to be potential queens. But after that, it depends on nutrition. So they have to get the right diet in order to develop into a queen. Otherwise, if they experience starvation or hunger or real thirst or something during early larval development, their bodies will turn off the queen development genes and they just grow up into workers. Males, I didn't really go into this earlier, but the males arise from unfertilized eggs. So you might remember early on, I said that the queen mates once, stores sperm in a little area called the spermatheca, which just means sperm sac. It's attached right onto the oviduct of the colony queen, and she can literally release as few as 3 to 5 sperm cells per egg that passes by, which is a really efficient use of those little cells that she's storing all her life long. And of course, it only takes one of them to fertilize that egg, but she can also make the decision, if you will. We don't know that this is conscious so much as just something about the, the weather or whatever, but she can make the decision to not fertilize eggs. And unfertilized eggs in these insects and the bees and the hunting wasps, and in fact, most Hymenoptera develop into males. So that's a little oddity of their sex determination mechanism. And those males, as a result of coming from unfertilized eggs, well, there's a couple of weird things about it. One is they have half the number of chromosomes of the females. So that's fine, fine for them. But another thing is they have no father. They only have a mother. It's sort of like the famed virgin birth of the Bible. You know, the virgin mother gives rise to a male offspring or something like that. I never actually thought of it that way until this moment, but it's kind of fantastic. Anyway, does that answer your questions, Jay?
A little bit, yeah, generally. So the only other follow-up I have is, are there ever situations where the queens, can there be several queens and they're non-competitive, or will the queen try and will one queen try and dominate to be the queen of the nest, or?
Right. Well, there's all kinds of variations on that theme. Those are great questions. So it goes all the way from right at the beginning of colony foundation, when the queen's all alone. She insists on being alone. There are other situations where she may team up with other queens, and later in the development of the colony, those other queens will persist and they'll all cooperate. Or at the end of the production of the first batch of workers, those other queens will disappear. And it may be either because of queen infighting, or even because the workers pile up on them and mob the less productive individuals among the multiple queens. So, and then there's these totally cooperative situations too. And that's where you get those polygyne colonies. Okay, I thought I saw Donna put up a hand. Was that an illusion?
Well, I can ask, I do have a question, and it goes with the queens. So you're saying that this queen is laying these eggs, and she's laying thousands of them, and most of them are going to be female. What determines which ones become the queen? Is it pheromonal?
Yeah. Well, there will be. Okay, let me try and say this simply. The colony queen does give birth, if you will, lay eggs that will develop into new potential colony queens, but not in her own nest. Those winged queens that come from the colony queen's eggs are destined to fly out and mate and found their own new colony. So now colonies can add queens, sometimes by one of these mated daughters coming back, or by even an unrelated mated queen following the mated flight coming back and getting accepted into the colony. And we don't, but a lot of times it looks like, yeah, and we have good genetic evidence that there are colonies out there that have not only multiple queens, but multiple worker broods that are the result of different mothers coexisting as part of the colony. So they're not even a family, literally, they're a blended family, if you will.
Okay.
Mary Pat. Oh, you'll have to unmute, Mary Pat. I can't hear you. Let's see, I bet I could do that.
I got it.
All right.
So in my home, I notice ants going, in some seasons, they're going away from the house, like toward the ground. And other seasons, they're coming and going in between cracks in the mortar and into the bricks. Or I figure they're in between the inside of the outer brick and the plaster wall. So, so how many thousands of ants do I cohabitate with?
Ha! What a great question. And thank you for not asking me how to get them out of your kitchen, because I don't answer that question. Just for all of you, I don't answer that question.
I just love watching them go into the bricks, and it's kind of cool.
Well,
And as long as I don't see them coming out the wall, it's kind of like, okay, wherever you are, it's okay.
yeah. Okay, so colony size varies widely in ants. Most of the ones that are likely to cohabit with us have colonies that number in the hundreds or even thousands. And so you have to just, it depends on the species, which, you know, how many you're going to have in there and how much space there is in there. A lot of times these, some of these ants that live around our houses and gardens have big diffuse colonies with little outposts here and there under this flagstone and another piece under the concrete landing of your deck steps and all sorts of different places spread around sort of for efficient resource gathering. Many times they'll actually they'll gather together into a big colony in some nice secure place for the winter when everything slows down. And then in spring, they start to spread out. And then the famous odorous house ants, which is a little black one that is common in houses all over North America, in the springtime, they're trying to get to a warm place so that the queen's ovaries can make eggs more rapidly, basically, because these things are dependent on ambient temperature for their physiology. Did that answer your question? Sort of, not really,
Yeah,
but
yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome. Anyone else? Jay again.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate. If anybody
That's all
else
right.
wants to-
You're up to
So
play.
were ants ever gigantic, like prehistoric? You know, during archaeological digs, have you come across ants from millions of years ago that were, you know, a foot long or something like that?
Well, there were none that big. And you know, that's pretty much getting up towards the maximum body length of any insects that were ever known. Even way back when, before when there was a period in the history of Earth known as the hyperoxygenic, which you might have heard of, when the atmosphere actually had over 30% oxygen in it. And because of that, the breathing system of insects was considerably more efficient than it is now. And so there were some giant insects, the big giant dragonflies with the 2-foot wing spreads and that sort of stuff. But ants didn't exist back then. That was prior to the origin of ants. The largest ants that ever existed had a roughly 2-inch body length and about a 4-inch wingspan. They're known from Queen's fossils that have been found in Wyoming and Germany. But we presume that at one time they existed across the temperate northern hemisphere, way back when. Anyway,
so how far back do you trace the existence of ants?
The best estimates, well, the oldest known specimens are only a little over 100 million years old, but they were already fully developed ants and had diversified considerably into multiple species and morphologies and different prey capture methods and all of that stuff, which we can tell by looking at their mandibles and so on. And but for them to have been so fully diversified already by 100 million years ago, we think they had to have come into existence at least, let's say, 20 million years or so before that. So some people put them back way back 150 million years. Some people say they're maybe 125 million years old, but we actually just have very sparse representation of any insect fossils from that period between the earliest amber fossils and the older stone and coal formation fossils. So that's the best answer I can give you. Dean Barnes, yes, sir.
Thank you, James. This has been good, but I got some questions about how they eat or how they hunt. Do they hunt in packs to take down larger prey? And do they all have venom? And then just the last question is, what do the larvae eat?
What do they eat? The larvae?
Yeah, you hear the first part?
I did hear the first part. Okay.
Okay.
Let's go from the last to the first. Larvae are entirely dependent on the parents for, or not the parents, but on their older sisters in the colony, the worker ants, for what they eat. So in the seed eaters, they may actually be placed directly on a grain, and the larvae, you know, after the worker chews it open, the larva actually eats the inside of the seed.
Okay.
Or they may be put onto a prey item. In other ants, the larvae may be given pre-chewed food, which is placed onto their mouth, and then they chew that up and swallow it themselves. Ants also, like many other social insects, may regurgitate from, they have a crop, a social stomach as they call it. It's a non-digestive storage component of their esophagus. And they can store undigested food, you know, sort of like a wolf coming home and feeding its young from the prey that it's fed on. They'll regurgitate it. As for the hunting strategies, that is widely variable depending on the species. Some ants are solitary hunters. Others have highly organized forays of multiple individuals where they go out in search of a particular prey item and then, you know, team up to subdue it and bring it home. And there's pretty much everything in between. But then in addition to that, there's a lot of scavenging going on. So one worker can find that slap mosquito, you may recall that slide. One worker found that and then ran home and brought the other nestmates out by laying down a pheromone trail to get help cutting it up and taking it home. So,
Do they all have venom? That they
do they all have venom? Yes, but not all of them have a stinger. A lot of ants have actually lost their stinger through evolution, and they apply the venom in other ways. They may actually squirt it through a little nozzle on the end of the abdomen onto prey or enemies, or they may just sort of smear it out of the end of the abdomen directly on prey, and that will create the the envenomation. But some of the ones that sting have venoms that are very similar to those of the hunting bees and the hunting wasps and the bees, sort of in the broad sense of being a soup of enzymes and histamine releasers and sometimes specialized smelly components that give a very characteristic odor to them, like formic acid or ketones or whatever, you know, you learned in organic chemistry.
Perfect. Thank you, James.
You're welcome.
So which variety are the best for chocolate covered ants?
Oh boy, now that's a really good question. You know, tastes, I don't know, my dad always used to like to say, de gustibus non est disputandum, which is a Latin phrase going, I'm not sure if it's actually classical or not, but it comes out of the Latin literature somewhere, and it literally means there can be no arguing about tastes. So I would have to say that some some ants might taste better to some people. You know, it's like some of us like IPAs and other people like stouts or so, or whatever analogy you want to make. Or you might be a bourbon guy, you know, I don't know. But anyway, it's like, yeah, we have, so I don't know about the best ants. I think, I think that various kinds of ants actually get used to make chocolate covered ants. But, you know, for my money, I would say ant brood is probably the best for eating because it's soft and doesn't have the venom glands developed yet or the chemical secretions, the defensive secretions. So, you know, it's probably more tasty and less noxious.
So how do creatures that eat ants in abundance, like quote anteaters, or chimps who use a stick, is the venom toxic for them, or can it build up? Or
well, apparently they're able to withstand it. So, for example, horned lizards, which we don't have around here, but you may have heard of these from the Southwest or down in Texas. Some of them are specialist predators on the big red harvester ants, which are kind of famous for their stings, and their stomachs literally are impaled with multiple stings of this ant that from when they swallow them without proper chewing, you know, which is a good lesson to you, you know, chew your food, you know, so it doesn't hurt you or whatever. But anyway, yeah, so they, but there are other, there's a lizard called Euta stansberryana in the Southwest. I think it's called an earless lizard in English, which are specialized predators on some of the smelly ants that forage on desert shrubs and trees along the waterways. And a herpetologist I knew was studying stomach contents of those ants to learn about their diet. And he said when he opened them up, they just reeked of the defensive secretions of the ants, almost to the point of knocking him over when he first experienced it. So they're just taking it in and somehow processing it, you know. It's kind of like milkweed feeding insects that eating all the milkweed alkaloids, and somehow they deal with it, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas,
James, I've got to run. Thank you very much. I'm going to drop off.
well, nice having you, Jay.
Thank you.
Bye. Yes, James.
I have myself. Okay. Do you want to speak at all about some of the ants that we have at Litzinger?
Sure.
Anything of interest that the volunteers might enjoy?
Well, as an urban ecologist, you might particularly be interested to know that we have the Litzinger, partly because of its array of habitats, has a nice little subset of the native ants of Missouri. There's about 150 species in Missouri. What did we get at Litzinger? A couple dozen or so?
I think we're at like 18.
Yeah.
16 or 18.
Yeah. The only kind of surprising one to me in that list was the little yellow Phaedole tysoni that we found near the very beginning of our survey. I really haven't seen that one in either that kind of soil or that kind of habitat before. It's usually in sandy, really well-drained sites. I've occasionally found them in glades, but basically we're talking about high degrees of drainage and larger particle size in the soil than what we see there at Litzinger. But there they are, although probably not anymore thanks to the construction project. But
that was in the past.
Yeah, and otherwise, there's just kind of a nice little subset of prairie ants and woodland ants and so on. But as I say, out of 150, you know, even if there are a full 24 species there, you know, that fraction that does pretty well with disturbance and is able to colonize, new appropriate habitat really easy, or as in the case of the ones over there right in the creek floodplain, just can tolerate really degraded conditions. And we did find about 10 of them over there, right there in the honeysuckle and winter creeper thicket, you know, doing okay. So that's just points to the adaptability of some species. Out at the Shaw Nature Reserve, just by contrast, nearly a half of the known Missouri ant species occur out there, someplace or another. And that has to do with the larger size of the habitat and diversity of the habitat fragments out there, and also the more amenable management pattern. Now, some things that are lacking at Shaw, or at least kind of diminished out there, because there's a lot of fire management, and you don't have a well-developed litter layer or large amounts of rotten wood. Some of the things that are characteristic of, you know, living in leaf litter or hollow twigs on the ground, or rotting log, or, you know, logs that are on the ground, things like that are not as well developed as they might be in, say, an old growth primary forest with very rare fire interval. On the other hand, species that like open ground, like the warm conditions, they're doing, and our soil nesting where they're protected from the fire, are doing pretty good, pretty well. And there's one thing I haven't studied very well out there at Shaw, but I know that there's a component of get a drink. Right back.
While he's getting a drink, I'm just going to say that Scott Barnes, you have the best background for any meeting I've ever seen.
All right, got my throat cleared. Where was I? Oh, arboreal species. And these live under bark and in galls and in hollow spaces and in dead parts of living trees. So, and I haven't studied them very well at Shaw. You kind of have to climb trees and whatever, and I haven't done enough of that. So there might even be more than those half of the fauna if I look carefully. The other thing, as you know, from our Litzinger survey, when we started sifting the rotten material where there was a log or a stump or a little bit of leaf litter, we found several things in pretty good abundance that were not found at the baits. So multiple collecting techniques become important and to do a full-on sampling, because the ants themselves have a wide variety of lifestyles and microhabitat preference.
Well, I'm excited to hopefully sometime soon get back to Litzinger, and then the potential of sampling again this year. But of course, if not this year, if we're not able to really get much time in during the growing season, hopefully we can sample next year.
Yeah. I have been out to Shaw, and I've just been frankly in such awe on my 2 visits since the reopening out there. It's been hard for me to even take very many pictures, you know. I'm just like kind of soaking it in. So yeah, I think you might have a similar experience when you all get back over there, which I wish for you soon.
I hope so.
It was there
All up in the
Saturday.
air.
It was beautiful.
So Scott and Dean, are you guys related at all? Scott Barnes and Dean Barnes?
I don't think so.
No.
No, I'm from
Okay.
Chicago area.
Oh yeah, that's a whole nother world over there. We're not related to anybody in Chicago, right?
Yeah.
I'm kidding. Wait. So anybody else with just overpowering ant questions? This has been really fun to be able to share with you, and I look to Look forward to seeing you here or there and sooner than later, you know?
Thank you, James.
Oh, yeah,
My
thank
pleasure.
you. This was so informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you
My
very
pleasure.
much, James. And there's a lot of thank yous in the chat box as well.
Cool. Well, I guess I ought to look at those. 9 of them. Oh, let's make sure there's no questions in that box.
There was one about queens, but I'm pretty sure you basically answered that when you answered Jay's question.
Yeah. Okay. Very good.
Hey, thanks, James.
All
Tell
righty.
James hi.
James, bye.
Okay. Well, now I got to do
Thank you.
a couple more of these this week. The different groups, so it'll be a different presentation each time.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Question
Sure.
from Marianne.
Marion.
I just was curious about 2 things. One about how much weight can an ant lift? Is it laid, and also about references for identifying ants or reading about ants' social life.
Yeah, well,
Oh boy. Okay, it's funny, just before we got on, I had this kind of sad email from somebody about an 11-year-old boy who's very interested in ants, just lost his father. Circumstances, I don't know, but anyway, and she wanted to like encourage him with stuff. So I kind of have it fresh in my mind what to say and answer those questions. There are, first of all, some online resources. I highly recommend something called AntWiki, which it's antwiki.org. And there's an awful lot of, there's some identification stuff, although it tends to be for bigger geographic area than our area. There's pictures of most every species in the world because they've liberally borrowed some images from AntWeb, another good site. And then there's some online ant discussion forums. I think the best one out there is called Formiculture, Formicure, Formiculture. It's very well monitored by the administrators, and there's people of all ages and all levels of experience. And then, but as far as books and so on, there are regional guides. I'm working on my Missouri one. Maybe we'll have that out in a year, I hope. And we shall see. Did that answer your question?
Yes, but I also wondered about, you saw them carrying those leaves. I just wondered about
right.
how much they can carry.
Yeah, they're carrying the weight. Part of that's just a trick of their surface to volume ratio of their muscles. They're able to. I heard somebody say the other day. By the way, if any of you are familiar with the ologies lectures that are online, there is one on myrmecology with my colleague Terry McGlynn, which covers some of this kind of stuff. And what Terry said in answer to that question, because everybody wants to know, was, well, if we were as small as ants, we could lift 10 times our weight easily too. And basically it's just physics. It has to do with the relationship of the volume of muscle tissue to the size of the surface that the muscles attach to inside the body. And that's kind of a lame explanation, but there's more to it than that. But you can actually calculate, the strength of a muscle. So, for example, the other thing that ants have going for them is that their muscles are attached to an external skeleton rather than an internal skeleton, and that gives them more potential for muscular attachment to provide, greater strength. Basically, if you, let's say you've got a bunch of longshoremen, standing around on a dock waiting to pull a ship in to dock and tie it in. If just one person grabs onto the rope, he'll have a considerably greater battle than if 5 of them grab the rope and pull on it. It's that much greater muscle mass working on the same size pulling device. Actually, it creates more pulling power. So that's sort of analogous to that in terms of the actual volume of muscle fibers and this, the area of attachment and relative to the size of what's being picked up. So I don't have any hard and fast numbers on how strong an ant might be. I think it probably varies to some extent, but there are these famous pictures online where people have given ants some heavy object and had them hang off of a leaf or a twig, and they're holding this thing that weighs 100 times their own weight and somehow managing to hold on. They can't really move with it, but they're.
Are they?
Yeah. So that's kind of my boy, all over the place answer to that question. We need a biophysicist to explain it. It's a good one though. Everybody wants to know.
So are they holding on to it with their legs or their arms or how are they holding the leaf?
I told you earlier, the mandibles are the all-important tool in the tool chest of ants.
Very best calling.
So they're basically their jaws. They use that to carry prey. They use it to manipulate the tiny little eggs and brood. They use them to fight, grab onto enemies, grab onto prey. Those mandibles are super important.
I'm here watching a
Thank you.
discussion on the telephone from her, where she volunteers.
I hear somebody in the background there.
Oh.
Is that Anne? Are you clapping? Oh, you're clapping. I didn't know if that was a raised hand or a clap.
No, I was appreciating. A number of years ago, you gave a presentation on ants to the Sierra Club, and I think you'd been kind of called in at the last minute, and I thought, oh, how strange! I wonder what this is going to be like. And it was one of the most fascinating talks that I had ever heard. And so I was happy to see that you were going to do this presentation here for Litzinger. It's just such an unusual study, but certainly one that you have spent a lot of time and developing your expertise in. So, and ants, we've all seen ants our whole lives, and we've killed a few too.
Oh, hers! Don't talk.
Especially as little kids, thinking, "Oh, look at that ant." But anyway, that was great. I really appreciate your presentation. So thank you very much.
No, thanks.
Okay.
I'm going to try and give a whole different one to the Webster Groves Nature Studies Society if you want to join their entomology group. But I haven't heard anything from the people who are supposed to contact me about that. And I don't know if that's tonight or next Monday, but you can check the WGNSS website and find that out. Maybe Leslie can tell you. I'll let her know.
I'll look. I'll check that out and see if I can find that out.
Yeah, I need to do that too. I have the talk ready, so it's not like I have to get another whole talk. I'm not going to use this one. I'm actually going to do a different one, so it'll be a different.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much for spending time with us this morning. It was very interesting, very informative. We really appreciate it, James.
It's been a lot of fun. Are we done here?
I
Perhaps,
think we can call that a wrap. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Well,
I reclaimed my host status, so I can end the meeting. So if we all want to say goodbye, that would be great.
All right, bye.
Thanks.
Bye,
see you
everybody.
soon.